Thank you. I would just like to start by thanking all of you here today for your generous support of the Institute for Advanced Study, as you are the ones who have made my year here in Princeton possible as the friends of the Institute for Advanced Study member in the School of Historical Studies, as Pamela just said. And I teach in the California State University system also, as Pamela noted. And what you may not know about education in California is that we have 3 different university systems. There's the community college system, there's the California State University system, and then there's the University of California system. You're probably much more familiar with the UC because that's the research organ of the state. The Cal State originated as a teacher's college, and as such, we don't have graduate students, maybe at the master's level. I don't, though my campus is very small. And what this means, practically speaking, is that I typically teach 4 classes a semester. Compare that with 2 classes a semester for my colleagues at Princeton. And you start to get a sense of how incredibly important it is to me to have had the possibility of this year with no teaching obligations, with no service obligations, with only my own research before me. And I can tell you it's been a very important year for me. I'm almost done with 1 book, and what I'm going to be sharing with you is about the book that I will be now moving into. So thank you to all of you for that. This talk is actually a small expression of my gratitude for your support as a way of sharing with you one component of the work that I have undertaken at this amazing institution. And I know I've probably met 1 or 2 of you in informal settings, and I'm very happy to have a chance to get to meet a few more of you, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions at the conclusion of the talk. Now, this talk emerges from the beginning of a new and ambitious research project that analyzes the way in which medieval Italian monasteries of the 9th through 12th centuries conceptualized their natural and built environments, with particular reference to history and sanctity. It asks how they represented this landscape to themselves in art, architecture, text, ritual, and topography. And it investigates how this representation supported concepts of communal identity. Bound within this project, which grows out of prior research on a single monastery outside of Rome, is an investigation of the role of topographic miracles in the construction of sanctity in the medieval Latin West. What I will share with you today is an article that I've prepared for publication in a volume on eco-art history and eco-aesthetics to be published by the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence. And I've chosen this text because it lays out quite clearly, I think, the general parameters of this project, and it introduces 2 of its case studies. To be situated in a landscape, to organize it, to inhabit it, are actions which presuppose an existential choice, the choice of the universe that one is prepared to assume by creating it. Man is altogether too much insisted on. The poet says, the proper study of mankind is man. I say to forget all that, take wider views of the universe. Ecology, eco-criticism, eco-aesthetics. It is frequently pointed out that these neologisms, for they are neologisms, the first appearing only in the 1860s and the latter not yet acknowledged in the Oxford English Dictionary, are rooted in the Greek term oikos, meaning house or dwelling. The terms denote modes of analysis, one scientific, one literary or rhetorical, one sensory or evaluative. The translation of home to environment confers to such analyses a latent ethical dimension. For to what are we more beholden than our individual or collective home? This ethical dimension underpins the 2 quotations above, albeit from opposite temporal and subject positions. Eliade places the ethical imperative in the creation of the oikos, Thoreau in its reception. If for Eliade, man is the generative principle, for Thoreau, we are, only caught in something much larger than ourselves. Each position brings with it a responsibility, the first to create with care, the second to attend to that which is received. In what follows, I will explore this double obligation in the very specific context of Latin Christian male monastic communities in Italy, first in the 6th and then in the 12th centuries. While much has been written about medieval monasticism from the perspectives of history, theology, and the arts, eco-considerations are largely absent. If our collective individual goal is to write a history of humanity in and with our oikos, then we have an obligation to consider what remains to this day one of the dominant modes of social organization in the Christian West, and perhaps the only one explicitly focused from the beginning on oikos creation. That the very tension outlined above between man as master of and as element in the natural world courses through Christian thought should drive any concerns of anachronism from our minds. Our terminology may be new, but the needs, demands, and desires we confront are quite literally as old as Christendom and creation. In keeping with the theme of this volume and with my own training as an art historian, my objective is an eco-aesthetic understanding of medieval monasticism. How did monastic communities perceive their natural world? What did they value about that perception? And how did they express that value in visual arts and architecture? Like Eliade, and like many other contemporary scholars, I seek to understand how these communities established the inherent sanctity of the locations in which they resided. Because of the central role of scripture and the wider textual apparatus of theology in framing Christian perception, an eco-critical approach is also essential. The assumption of a literary structure enables the question that drives my inquiry and that separates it from prior investigations of Italy's sacred Christian landscapes. What happens if we also listen to Thoreau, positioning the natural world not as the backdrop to a transaction between God and man, but as an independent and necessary protagonist, or often antagonist, in sacred drama? How did male monastic communities respond eco-aesthetically to this active topography, particularly in instances in which they found themselves living within such a landscape? For reasons that will shortly be made clear, the monasteries encompassed by my inquiry are all associated with the dialogues of Pope Gregory the First, most likely written between 593 and 594. Located primarily in central Italy, these monasteries were dedicated to or believed to have been inhabited by a figure discussed in the dialogues. All were established as male communities, and quite likely all followed the rule of St. Benedict. All were founded initially not later than the 9th century, and most were renovated during the 11th or 12th century. They range from the most famous of Italian Benedictine houses, the Abbey of Monte Cassino, to those of modest fame, such as San Eutizio at Norcia, on the screen here, to those like Nonnosis's foundation on Monte Sorate that have been largely forgotten. St. Eutizio serves as a cautionary tale. The damage, actually almost complete destruction of this monastery and the damage throughout the central Apennines by the seismic sequences of 2016-2017 is a reminder that despite their seeming stability, landscapes are fragile and subject to sudden change. Their documentation and study are as essential as that of any other work of human creation. Several factors make the dialogues an appropriate heuristic for an eco-aesthetic investigation of medieval Italian monasticism. Working from a single text provides a common point of departure for individual case studies. Yet despite their shared history, as noted above, these Gregorian sites differ widely in their medieval and modern fortunes. One of the most widely disseminated literary works of the European Middle Ages, the dialogues both drew on and contributed to Christian attitudes towards the conjunction of sanctity and topography. Most importantly, this conjunction was one of Gregory's paramount concerns. The dialogue's objective was to demonstrate peninsular sanctity by recalling virtuous and miracle-working persons operating in diverse Italian settings. Gregory's interlocutor, the deacon Peter, announces this mission in a lament, quote, "I do not know of any persons in Italy whose lives give evidence of extraordinary spiritual powers. This land of ours has undoubtedly produced its virtuous men, but to my knowledge, no signs or miracles have been performed by any of them." To which Gregory responds, "On the contrary, Peter, the day would not be long enough for me to tell you about those saints, whose holiness has been well established, and whose lives are known to me from either my own observations or the reports of good, reliable witnesses." The miracle stories that Gregory proceeds to relate are grounded firmly in the Italian built and natural landscape, with its dramatis personae placed in relation to cities, churches, monasteries, and Roman consular roads, and to cliffs, rivers, lakes, caves, mountains, and valleys. And this sort of a little map of locations and a table in French of miracles, operative miracles involving natural elements. So myriad miracles emerge from the natural world. Voices emanate from cliffs, rocks halt in mid-fall, serpents obey spoken commands, caves shelter hermits, briars discipline rebellious bodies, harvests abound. Other miracles pertain to a settled terrain. Rocks vanish from arable land, building materials are exorcised, temples are consecrated as churches. The monks who settled into these Gregorian landscapes further bound sanctity and topography, erecting churches to instantiate locational holiness while tending the landscape itself, cultivating, shaping, preserving, adorning, depicting, and traversing it. The questions become how, why, and to what ends? What patterns and processes can we discern? What might we gain by attempting to see landscape not as backdrop to, but as protagonist in monastic history? The locational dimension of sanctity is thematized from the dialogue's first story. Even before introducing the saint, Gregory situates the events to follow in the geography of post-Roman Italy. He then relates two miracles affected by this saint whose name is Honoratus. So, on the estate of the late Senator Venantius in the district of Samnium lived a tenant whose son, Honoratus, when only a boy, had cultivated a deep love for his heavenly home by the practice of abstinence. When the meat was served, Honoratus would not take any. His parents began to laugh at him and asked, "Do you expect us to have fish up here in the mountains?" I know, children, right? For where they were living, fish was not to be had. Just then, the supply of water for the meal gave out. So, as was customary there, a servant took a wooden bucket to the spring to get some. You know what's going to happen, right? Yeah. As it was filling, a fish slipped in. When he got back and poured out the water in the presence of all, to their amazement, they saw the fish. I left it out, but they just stopped laughing at him at that moment, right? His parents are like, oh, okay. His unusual progress and holiness and the miracles he performed soon led Venantius to grant him his freedom. Honoratus then built a monastery at Fondi, where as abbot of nearly 200 monks and edified the entire countryside by his saintly life. One time, for example, a huge mass of rock had broken loose from the mountain that towered high above the monastery, and as it rolled down, threatened to demolish the buildings and kill the monks. The holy abbot raised his right hand toward it, and with the sign of the cross opposed its fall, all the while invoking the name of Christ. By doing so, he stopped it where it was on the steep mountainside. Today, the huge rock still appears to be on the verge of rolling down, for nothing can be seen there that would block its fall. In these stories, ecological aspects are patent. Location comes first, allowing sacred history to unfold within defined physical and social places. The antagonist is mountainous terrain. In the first episode, it refuses to provide a condition necessary for holy living, that is, fish, to support the saint's abstemious diet. The discovery of a fish in the local spring is both an operation against topographical determinism and a miracle of sustenance. In the second vignette, it looses a rock to threaten the progress of Christianity, requiring a topographical intervention brought about through the combined authority of the saint and the cross. These miracles point toward the challenges in precisely defining the origins of ecological responses. From an Eliadean perspective, that Honoratus is not present at the spring indicates the degree to which his sanctity radiates through and transforms the land. A Thoreauvian reading finds evidence of a latent natural divinity, recognizing a worthy catalyst for its expression. The second miracle has a tenor akin more to an exorcism than to the revelation of support for Christianity within a seemingly uncooperative environment. For both episodes, the biological metaphor of symbiosis is apt. Only when a potentially active topography, divine or diabolic, and a potentially holy individual interact at the same place can the miraculous occur. That Italy autochthonously offers both conditions is the primary lesson of Gregory's dialogues. No site has been attached to the evocatively, if generally described, villa of Venantius, but Honoratus' monastery is today identified with the church of San Magno at Fondi, a small city on the Via Appia, midway between Rome and Naples. So Naples down here, Rome up there, Fondi in the middle. The site 4 kilometers northwest of Fondi at the base of Monte Casareccio here, and there's the monastery there. These are taken with a telephoto from the top of a neighboring mountain. The site 4 kilometers northwest of Fondi at the base of Monte Casareccio matches Gregory's description, including a precarious boulder visible on the hillside. There are actually many precarious boulders visible on the hillside, so another thing just to keep in mind. The recently restored Renaissance church was built over a medieval one, in turn constructed on a Roman structure of uncertain function. Despite this lengthy architectural history, no clear evidence exists for monasticism prior to the 9th or early 10th centuries, not on this site. Such disjunction between believed and empirical history is encountered frequently in medieval studies. Eco-aesthetic analysis requires us to adopt an emic approach, prioritizing the medieval community's understanding of its own past. Yet additional challenges arise. We must separate out seemingly medieval beliefs, many of which actually originated during the 16th century Counter-Reformation, from actual medieval beliefs. And we must account for dynamism in medieval beliefs themselves. San Magno demonstrates these issues starkly. While suggestive, the antiquity of the boulder's identification with the one stopped by Honoratus is unknown. There was a cross on the top of one of the rocks on the mountain. It was removed recently, but whether that was the same rock, who knows. Gregory recorded Honoratus' Vita in the 6th century, but those of Magnus and his colleague Paternus are first known from a 16th century manuscript made for Cardinal Cesare Baronio, an important Counter-Reformation figure. Internal evidence suggests that these vitae, so carefully keyed to San Magno's medieval topography, may have been written as early as the 9th century, yet they make no mention of Honoratus. Nor am I aware of any coeval vitae of Honoratus or of his disciple, also mentioned by Gregory, Libertinus. The only known dedication for either church or monastery is in fact San Magno. The conclusion is that from the 9th century on, that is for the monastery's entire attested history, veneration of Honoratus was secondary to that of Magnus and Paternus, if it occurred at all. Only, in fact, between 1072 and 1215 does a cult of Honoratus at San Magno seem likely. In 1072, the monastery became a dependency of Monte Cassino, and an orientation towards Cassinese Benedictine monasticism is evident in a contemporaneous renovation of the church that added wall paintings with scenes from the life of Benedict and bust portraits of saints and monks. And that's what you're seeing here are the saints and monks and scenes largely destroyed, but from the life of Saint Benedict. Veneration of Saint Benedict would have required a copy of his Vita, presented in Book 2 of the Dialogues, to be part of the monastery's library. The acquisition of a copy of Book 1 would have also furnished the monastery with the Vitae of Honoratus and Libertinus, and yet another person, an unnamed gardener, also associated with the same monastery. That San Magno did come to possess relics of Honoratus and Libertinus is attested by a late medieval document describing their 1215 translation to a church inside of the walls of Fondi. San Magno remained subject to Monte Cassino until 1474, but whether either 1215 or 1474 marked the end of Honoratus' cult is unknown. We thus have a situation in which empirical and believed history openly conflict, and medieval beliefs are seen to be mutable. How then to proceed? My intent is to pursue two avenues. The first is to study the monastery's structural remains and material culture, including possessions and dependencies, to seek evidence for any cult of Gregorian saints or devotional engagement with a natural setting. The other is a textual investigation of San Magno's historical and liturgical self-presentation. How did San Manya construct its history and community? What saints did it recall and how? And what can be learned about its relations, quotidian and ritual, to its built and surrounding natural topography? To flesh out the possibilities of such investigation, I offer another case, the Monastery of Elijah at Castel Sant'Elia and its church, Sant'Elia. And this is the topic of the book that I am within like 3 weeks of finishing. I'm very happy. Again, thank you for the time, right? Built circa 1124 to 26 by Bovo, an abbot with connections to Pope Calixtus II, Sant'Elia occupies the site of an earlier structure, probably a church, built no later than the 10th century. A paucity of written sources forecloses extensive historical analysis, and the occupation of the cloister by a modern cemetery largely precludes archaeology. So church, this is where the cloister would have been. The cemetery was built in the 1850s and 60s. Art historians have mainly studied Sant'Elia in the context of provincial Romanesque art or narrative cycles of the apocalypse. I don't necessarily agree with those approaches, but this is what has been done in the past. Questions as to why this Roman style and these apocalyptic images, for instance, were employed at this specific monastery have been addressed only in terms of generic Christian doctrine and iconographic affiliations, and these are the apocalypse images here, some of them. Yet, as Gregory the Great himself tells us in his Vita of the Abbot Anastasius, topography is the monastery's raison d'etre and the source of its sanctity. The links between monastery and landscape can be divided into two basic categories, devotional and political, each manifesting a discrete set of relations. The division is not neat. The monastery's political efficacy depended in part on its spiritual status, including its ties to the dialogues, while the financing that enabled it to reach its devotional potential arrived precisely because of its political utility. In what follows, I will speak exclusively to the monastery's early 12th century phase. I will also only address the devotional elements, as I have discussed the political argument in extensio elsewhere, and that is the article in Gesta, which Pamela mentioned in her introduction. So Anastasius, in the monastery of Suppentonia, near the city of Nepi, is another of Gregory's site-bound saints, who fled a career as a notary in Rome to become abbot of a remote foundation where, and now I'm going to quote at length again from the dialogues, a steep mountain rose to a great height over the monastery, and below it a deep chasm. Now, when the time had come for God to reward the labors of Anastasius, I'm sorry, I should have pointed out, Nepi is here, the monastery is here, so close to Nepi. Now, when the time had come for God to reward the labors of Anastasius, a voice was heard one night calling from the top of the cliff in prolonged tones, "Anastasius, come." 7 other monks were called by name the same way. A short period of silence followed, and then the voice summoned another monk. There was no doubt in the mind of anyone that death awaited those who had thus been summoned. Within a few days, Anastasius died. The others were summoned in the order in which they had been called. One of the monks had come to kneel at Anastasius' bedside, pleading, "By the God whom you are going to face soon, I beg you, let me depart from this world within 7 days after you have passed away." He died about a week after Anastasius. Located 2.5 kilometers from Nepi, Sant'Elia sits on a platform on the side of a steep slope. One view here, one view here. A cliff rising above and the Trea torrent far below. A document dated 557 records a transaction involving an Abbot Anastasius, a monastery of Sant'Elia, and a church in Nepi. Parts of the crypt may date to the 6th century. In comparison then to San Manya, we are already on much firmer historical footing. Here, medieval beliefs track with empirical evidence and Gregorian text. Monastery and dialogues are first linked in a Vita of Odo of Cluny, penned shortly after that saint's death in 942. Odo had reformed 5 convents in and around Rome, including the monastery of St. Elijah, which is called Suppentonia, which Gregory discussed in his dialogues. That's a quote from Odo's Vita. A connection to the dialogues, though, did more than establish antiquity. Gregory identified the monastery of Supantonia as the site of a theophany engendered by monastic virtue. God spoke to Anastasius from the top of a cliff, summoning him to heaven, much as he had spoken on Mount Horeb to Elijah, who was also rapt to heaven. The implication is that if operated with full virtue, the monastery could again be a site of divine contact and heavenly ascent, a status ensured by its conformity to Gregory's sacred topography. The double history of guidance by a Gregorian saint and reform by a Cluniac one lent additional significance to Bovo's reconstruction. While no evidence exists for a cult of Odo, a desire to bind the monastery to its Gregorian past was incontrovertibly one of Bovo's guiding principles. At least 4 strategies were deployed to effect this binding: topographical modification, the dedication of altars, pictorial representation, and liturgy. Each of these strategies depended directly or indirectly on the monastery's natural setting. The most valuable evidence for dating this renovation is an inscription preserved in a chapel on the plateau above Sant'Elia, and this is the clifftop chapel here, inscription, transcription and translation. It reads, "In the name of the Lord, I, Abbot Bovo, renewed this altar to the honor of the Holy Trinity and all the blessed ranks of angels, and blessed Pope Gregory in the time of Lord Pope Honorius II in the 4th indiction." Previous scholars have understood this altar dedication with its date of 1126, that's the 4th indiction under Honorius II, to be a membrum disiectum from Sant'Elia, from the main church. I propose that the inscription is actually exactly where it's always been, in a chapel built or restored by Bovo to further sanctify the site whence emanated God's voice. The 3 dedicatees confirm this proposal. The Trinity is God, the angels are his messengers, his voice, and blessed Pope Gregory is Gregory the Great. This interpretation is confirmed by a fresco on the east wall of Sant'Elia's south transept, depicting the summoning of Anastasius, his death, and the burial of the other monks. There's 7 monks plus either Anastasius or the monk who was called after his death. The fictive architecture in this painting corresponds to that of the 12th century church and chapel: cut stone masonry, tiled roofs, round-headed windows, nave arcades. At center is a campanile, here, a bell tower. Its 3 vigorously ringing bells figure the Trinity and the voice of God, an interpretation supported by consecration rituals that use the 28th Psalm to identify monastic bells explicitly as the Vox Domini, the voice of God. At upper right is the summoning. A large angel stands with his back to the campanile. The voice of God emanating from the Trinitarian bells passes through his body to address the 7 monks assembled beneath his wing and behind the apse of the small fictive church. This emulates, in fact, the position of the angel's head emulates the relation between Sant'Elia and the top of the cliff. This constellation of Trinity, angel, and setting confirm, I think, that the chapel is both integral to the monastery and in its original, and that the altar inscription is proper to it. This does not exhaust the fresco's topographical response. To the left of the campanile is a second image of the church, now showing its interior where Anastasius' funeral is in progress. The saint lies supine on his bier, his head toward the fictive church's apse. His sight line, were he to open his eyes, would actually lead him to the apse, the main apse of Sant'Elia itself, where he would see his radiant body present with Christ in paradise. 3 clergy dressed in dalmatics and albs stand at his head. One holds an open book and blesses the body. One holds a processional cross, and all have their mouths open as if in song. If we consider the fresco as a whole, the church at the upper right slides into the position of the chapel above and behind the larger church's apse. At lower right, a third scene depicts the entombment of 8 monks. They lay awkwardly in a vaulted enclosure, garments askew. In a typical Romanesque vision of death, it's as if they're doing a backstroke. Right? That's how you know people are dead in the Middle Ages. At the apex of this enclosure, two small hands denote God blessing his holy dead, here and here. And there are actually little lines emanating from the hands, showing sort of that radiating out of the sanctificatory power. Here, a topographical relationship also exists, for the placement of God's hands in relation to the painted church above indicates the site of its high altar, right here, at the end of the nave transept, where it joins the apse. And it aligns the enclosure, in fact, with the crypt that is beneath the apse and transept at Sant'Elia. Beauvau's artist has thus mapped Anastasius' miraculous end, as related by Gregory, onto the natural and liturgical environment of his rebuilt monastery. The architectural setting of the fresco indicates that it should be considered an altarpiece avant la lettre, identifying an altar dedicated to Anastasius. The current south altar is a post-medieval pastiche, but three apertures in the wall, here, here, and here, two small rectangular holes sited approximately 2 meters apart, and a larger arch niche a little more than 1 meter above the pavement and aligned with the painted campanile, suggests that this altar preserves the memory, the physical spatial memory of an earlier one. The inclusion of Anastasius' relics within the altar would have transformed it into his tomb. The altar's position on axis with the crypt stairs tied it to this lower area of sacred death where his brethren would have been understood to rest. And these are the stairs leading down into the crypt. A dedication of the south transept to Anastasius is supported by his appearance at the south side of the apse. If you remember that image, he's standing sort of right here, Christ at the center, he's over at the edge. And by a similar distribution of images of Elijah the prophet on the north side of the church. Altars and images enable the monastery's landscape, and implicitly that of its Sinaitic model where Elijah had been, to flow into the church, binding a sacrality immanent in nature, immanent in nature with an A, with one established through art, architecture, and liturgy, Thoreau and Eliade combined. The location of Anastasius' altar is significant. A 12th century doorway still extant in the south transept would presumably have led to the dormitory and would have been used by the monastic community as they entered the church each day for matins, the office that begins the liturgical day. They thus would have passed by the tomb of their saintly predecessor every day as they began their daily Opus Dei, the monastic liturgy of the hours and the Eucharist, made all the more effective by the monastery's encompassing of holy ground. This observation opens onto the last topographic strategy operative at the monastery of Elijah, liturgy. Here, the pictorial details of the figure in the campanile vigorously tolling the bells, and of the open mouths, book, and cross, and blessing hands in Anastasius' funeral gain relevance. On one level, these details add vivacity and immediacy to the events depicted. They make the images come to life. The visual centrality of the bells, in particular, mimic the use of bells as an audible structure to the monastic day. On a deeper level, the duplication of the 12th century monk's own practices for the monastic funeral is patently a 12th century one. It aligns with descriptions of such that we have from service books from this region of Italy. Within the paintings of Anastasius' 6th century death, cemented the binding of past and present that began with the topographical alignment of a physical monastery to a textual one. The specific moments of duplication were those at the center of the monastery's communal system. The celebration of Anastasius' feast day, when Gregory's narrative would have served as a main liturgical text, the funeral of a current abbot, and the annual commemoration of a defunct abbot. The latter two, and possibly all three, would have included a performance of the full office of the dead, the same ritual which is portrayed in the fresco. At these moments, pictorial and physical monastic communities would allied, deceased abbots arising as second Anastasiuses, and 12th century monks understanding themselves as Anastasius's own brethren, open to the summons of God. Monastic ritual also had a strong spatial dimension, from entrances and movements through church and choir, to actions in the cloister, to processions that move through the monastic landscape as a whole. I've touched briefly on only two aspects of spatialized ritual at the monastery of Elijah, the entrance at Matins and the performance of the Office of the Dead in the south transept. Unfortunately, none of the monastery's own service books are known. They were long dissipated, and any that might have remained were probably burned in the early 19th century when Napoleon invaded this area of Italy. But a next phase in this project for me would involve the study of customaries from other central Italian monasteries and other service books. In particular, I would like to know more about the types of celebrations that would have brought the community to the chapel, as arriving there they would have traversed the entirety of their Gregorian landscape. There's much more, too, that could be learned about the connections of the monastery of Elijah to its landscape. I have not, for instance, discussed its dependencies, nor have I considered its secular effects, for instance, through the founding of the village named Castel Sant'Elia. I've only hinted at the typological aspects of the monastery's landscape, such as its connection to the desert and cliffs frequented by its titular Saint Elijah. A metaphorical link may also be found to the island of Patmos, where John the Evangelist had the visions of the apocalypse frescoed on Sant'Elia's transept walls. But I hope that I have at least begun to illustrate in ways both theoretical and concrete the possibilities of foregrounding topography as an active generative principle within medieval Italian monasticism, and the benefits of thinking eco-critically and eco-aesthetically through the dialogues of Gregory the Great. Thank you.